Hello. Thank you for joining us for this webinar presentation on BART's Disparate Impact and Disproportionate Burden Policy. Our presenters today are Rachel Russell and Seema Parameswaran. I am Rachel Russell, and I will begin our presentation. We'll begin our presentation with an overview of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Then we'll discuss what a disparate impact and disproportionate burden policy is. We'll introduce BART's proposed thresholds and provide examples of how these thresholds will be applied. Then, if a disproportionate impact is found, we will discuss what BART's steps will be. Lastly, we'll wrap up with next steps and how you can contact BART if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 requires that no persons in the United States shall on the grounds of race, color, or national origin be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Effective October 2012, FTA requires BART to develop a major service change policy, which we have already fulfilled and has been approved by the FTA in 2011. We are also required to develop a disparate impact and disproportionate burden policy, which is the basis of our webinar. Title VI requires BART to conduct an equity analysis on all major service change and fare changes. The disparate impact and disproportionate burden policy will establish thresholds to determine when adverse effects are borne disproportionately by protected populations or riders. The disparate impact and disproportionate burden policy will be used for interpreting the results of our major service change and fare change equity analysis. The FTA gives agencies leeway to develop a policy that works best for their own organizations. During our process to develop the thresholds, we considered multiple factors. Our first factor was business and operational needs. We did not want to set the threshold too low so that BART cannot proceed or would deter the implementation of projects that would be beneficial to protected populations. However, we did not want to set the threshold too high that it was unreasonable and could potentially mask disparities. Secondly, we were working on updating our station profile study, which is the main data set we use for our equity analysis. We are currently working with MTC to update our current 2008 station profile study. This could mean BART would be using a new survey methodology with new questions and new sample sizes, producing a new data set that will be different from BART's data set that is currently used. We also considered BART's historical data. We evaluated the results of our previous equity analysis to see what the impacts may have been on protected populations. These are the thresholds that we are proposing. For across the board and other fare changes, we are proposing a 5% threshold. For changes to fare types such as youth fares or senior discounts, we are proposing a 10% threshold. For setting new fares, such as the Open Airport Connector Project or BART, we are proposing a 10% threshold. When evaluating major service changes, we are proposing a 5% threshold for all major service changes to existing services. For new services, such as the Open Airport Connector or BART, we are proposing a 10% threshold. The proposed thresholds will apply to adverse effects of fare changes and major service changes. Now, Seema will provide examples of how these thresholds will be applied to BART's major service and fare change equity analysis.
The first example we will discuss is for an across-the-board fare change. This chart shows an example using historical data of past fare changes at BART. In 2009, the average fare increase for riders who reported themselves as minority was 8.28%. The average fare increase for riders who reported themselves as non-minority was 8.09%. This is a difference of 0.19%. The threshold provides a clear defining line to evaluate when we have a disparate impact or disproportionate burden on protected populations. When looking at the difference between low-income riders and non-low-income riders for the 2009 fare change, the difference is about 0.32%. Still, these differences, 0.19 and 0.32, are less than our 5% threshold. So, there is no disparate impact or disproportionate burden found on protected populations. In 2012, BART implemented a 1.4% across-the-board fare change, resulting in a 0.05 difference between protected and non-protected populations. In 2014, we are planning a 5.2% fare increase, and the table shows that there will be a difference between 0.01% between protected and non-protected populations. Still, no disparate impact or disproportionate burden is found from these fare changes, since the differences are less than 5%. The next example we will discuss is changes to fare type. When making changes to fare type, we look at the data differently than we would when considering across-the-board fare changes. Examples of changes to a single fare type include discounts to senior fares or increasing the maximum age for youth discounts. All riders at BART using all fare media at all stations report themselves as 62.3% minority and 37.7% non-minority. However, when we look at the disabled riders, 72.2% report themselves as minority. The difference between disabled minority riders, 72.2%, and all minority riders, 62.3%, is 9.9%. This is under the 10% threshold we are proposing. So, there is no disparate impact found on minority populations. However, when we look at the low-income disabled riders, which report themselves as 70.3%, as compared to the overall low-income riders, which report themselves as 43.3%, there is a difference of 27.1%. This does exceed our 10% threshold and would result in a disproportionate burden on low-income disabled riders. Since we have found a disproportionate burden on low-income disabled riders, BART will have to take additional steps, and we will outline these additional steps later on in the presentation. The final example we will discuss pertains to service. For major service changes, we will assess whether protected populations or riders are disproportionately impacted. We are proposing a 5% threshold for changes to existing service. When we do a service equity analysis, we do a quantitative analysis of the travel time impacts. The first example shows a major service change that occurred in 2008 along the Red Line, which at the time went from Richmond to Daly City. The major service change would extend service on the Red Line to Millbrae BART. This means the new Red Line route would be from Richmond to Millbrae Station. The travel time analysis showed a reduction in travel time of 16.4% for minority populations and 16.8% for non-minority populations, which is a difference of 0.04%, which is within our 5% threshold. In this case, there is no disparate impact or disproportionate burden found. We also see a similar travel time savings with the Oakland Airport Connector project. And similarly, there is no disparate impact or disproportionate burden found. In the case of new fares, new modes, and new services, we are proposing a 10% threshold. Disproportionate impact findings require that BART undertake additional measures to justify or lessen impacts. If a disparate impact is found on minority populations, BART may take steps to avoid, minimize, or mitigate impacts. If the additional steps do not mitigate potential impacts on minority populations, BART may proceed with a proposed change if there is a substantial legitimate justification for the proposed major service or fare change and there are no alternatives serving the same legitimate objectives that would have a less disproportionate impact on minority populations or riders. If a disproportionate burden is found on low-income populations, BART may take steps to avoid, minimize, or mitigate impacts on low-income populations where practicable. BART shall also describe in the equity analysis any alternatives available. This language is directly from FTA's Title VI circular. Thank you for listening to our webinar on BART's disparate impact and disproportionate burden policy. We invite you to provide comments, ask questions, or provide any suggestions on the policy. You can contact BART in the following ways. By U.S. mail, you can mail to the Office of Civil Rights, 300 Lakeside Drive, Suite 1800, Oakland, California 94612. By fax, area code 510-464-7587. By phone, area code 510-464-6752. Or email at officeofcivilrights@bart.gov. We request that you provide your comments by Friday, June 21st, 2013.